I once heard a story about a Unitarian Universalist church member named John. John came to church every single Sunday. He was retired, but busier than any of us with full-time jobs. He was committed, effective, and clear, however, about what he could and would and what he believed he should contribute to the causes that he cared for the world and the people that he cared for. But what set him apart from us was that every single Sunday, and because of hearing loss, not more than any sense of self-importance, he sat in the front row. His minister asked him, "Why do you come, John? In all kinds of weather, when you're well and when you're not, when you like the guest speaker and when you know that you won't, why do you come every Sunday?" His answer was straightforward, just like he was. "I come," he said, "because somebody might miss me if I didn't." He worked hard on Sunday mornings. He got up on Sundays expecting to work hard to make others feel at home. And he was right, because after he died, his congregation missed him when he didn't come. And you know what happened? The Sunday after his memorial, someone new walked right in and sat down in the empty place in the front pew. They came hoping that there was room, and John himself would have been absolutely delighted. John was a church member who took his promise of church membership very seriously. In good times and in bad, whether he agreed with everything said or not, he showed up. Because if he did, someone might miss him. As a non-creedal tradition, our coming together as a church is based not on adherence to a shared creed, but on covenant, a relationship of promise and commitment, and a recognition of our interconnectedness. Our covenant is shaped by what we value. So if we believe, as we have preached these past 2 weeks in our UU 101 sermon series, that all people are worthy of love and justice, and that we are called to build heaven here on earth, this has an effect on our ways of being together. We are a promise-making people. We create and recreate, break and renew our covenantal relationships again and again. We live in relationship, whether or not we choose or recognize those bonds. Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker says that we receive who we are before we choose who we will become. Similarly, we inherit covenant before we ever intentionally create it. The way our lives unfold and the choices we make are shaped by many things, including genetics, family, culture, social systems, and communities of which we are a part. And we inherit covenant by virtue of being born and given the gift of life, by being born on this earth that sustains us, and by the gift of human community. Not only do we inherit these covenantal relationships, but we create it and recreate it in various forms throughout our lives, including here at church. Parker says that there are 2 questions we must ask ourselves as we build covenantal communities. We must ask, what have we been given? And what is the covenant we are already in? Another way of asking these questions, a very theological question, is whose are we? Each of us has people who carry us in their minds and hearts, and there are people who are in our circle of concern. Each of us has our people, whether tied by blood or culture or faith. Each of us has those to whom we are responsible and accountable. Each of us is called by a still small voice within or beyond, and each of us is held by something larger than ourselves. Covenant is our human response to the question, whose are we? Now, it requires profound humility to acknowledge the reality that as free, independent human beings, we are not ourselves alone. It sometimes takes a fracture in our covenant to wake us up to this reality and to humble us. For example, our response to tragedy that breaks covenant is to lift up our unity. Dallas strong, we said after the recent police shooting here in our city. Or we are Orlando, we said, after the tragedy at the nightclub there. In the face of loss and violence, we seek to remind ourselves of our interrelatedness. When covenant is broken, we seek to reestablish community and covenant through remembering our unity, that we are not ourselves alone. We belong to, we are held by, and we are responsible to one another, to our world, and to the transcendent power of love that many call God. When we talk of marriage, family, or church community, our understanding of covenant runs the risk of becoming too narrow. In some cases, it turns into a circling of the wagons, something we alone create between two people or in a small group. But Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams reminds us that covenant is not to be understood as simply a human enterprise. It is a response to a divinely creative power, a sustaining power, a community-transforming power. And this power is ultimately not of our own making. Nor is covenant only a verbal or written agreement, such as our 7 UU principles or the affirmation that we say here every Sunday. These are covenantal statements, but the words mean nothing if we do not put them into practice. Covenant is our response to the gift of life and the freedom given to us. Guided by these covenants, we seek to live in peace and right relationship with others and with the source of life. Our congregation's commitment to service and justice is rooted in a recognition of our covenant with those beyond these walls. The well-being of our neighbors is tied up with our own. And our care of and service to one another here, through pastoral care, through deep listening in circles, through engaging with one another in classrooms, these are all ways that we put our covenant into practice. Covenant is also a gift given to us by our religious ancestors. So to be in right relationship with our Unitarian Universalist past, we must understand where all of this promise-making and covenant-creating comes from. It goes back to 16th century England, where the free church tradition emerged in resistance to the corrupt, hierarchical power of the Church of England and its ties to the aristocracy. The Puritans, so called because they sought to purify the church and its practices, developed their own alternative forms of church, asserting the power of the people to self-govern and self-determine within the container of a covenantal community. Their practice of covenant was to build a life, a church, and a world that reflected their hopes and their vision. The Puritans believed that people must gather regularly to learn and worship together in order to make what they called the spirit of mutual love real in their community. The Bible, they said, was about the free and covenanted social practice of love, expressed through the covenant between God and people and in local congregations since the time of Jesus and the disciples. So the communities and congregations formed by these people strove to be true to that vision. Many of the Puritans left England as the religious and political situation worsened and traveled to New England, seeking a place to freely practice this new way of doing church. Once here in this country, they developed what is called the Cambridge Platform, which is still the basis for our polity today, for how we organize as a congregation and relate to other congregations. It is because of the Cambridge Platform that we exist as an autonomous congregation in relationship with other UU congregations around the country. We have no bishop or hierarchy above us, but rather a democratic process involving the voices of our members. Our history of covenant, from its biblical roots to its formalization in the 17th century to its reimagining in the 20th century, calls us to live in ways that embody loving, just, and sustainable community. But as we all know, we human beings sometimes fail at this. It was the breaking of covenant that brought our Puritan ancestors to America in the first place. They thought that they had won their effort to reform English society when their ally Oliver Cromwell came to power. But once Cromwell gained that position of authority, his economic interests led him to turn on the reformers who had helped bring him to power in the first place. He did not honor his covenantal commitment to his people. As a result, many of the reformers left for America. We are a promise-breaking and a covenant-breaking people too. Not because we're inherently bad or flawed, but because we are human beings. I've had to apologize or ask for forgiveness more than once this week, I don't know about you, for not assuming generously or for not hearing what was really said to me. We make mistakes, we disappoint, and others let us down as well. It happens in marriages and families, in working relationships and communities. And in this age of email and social media, it feels like this happens now more than ever. But I sometimes wonder whether in the days before email and phones, whether our letter-writing ancestors had this much trouble staying in right relationship. They probably did, because they were human after all. The reformers driven away under Cromwell's leadership were disillusioned by broken promises, but they didn't give up. They continued searching until they were able to tap into a spirit of life and love that they realized had never broken faith with them, and which helped them to renew the bonds of covenant. That is the purpose of covenant, to let and to make real and evident the bonds of love that will never let us go, and to lift us towards the vision that we seek. Covenant requires of us a spirit of generosity and compassion. I love the video of Brene Brown that was our first reading because she gives us tools for practicing covenant. She doesn't ever use the word covenant anywhere in the video, but she talks about being in compassionate, generous, and boundaried relationship with one another. Boundaries are key to creating and recreating covenant because they help us define where you end and I begin, and vice versa. As she says, what is okay and what is not okay, and therefore what commitments we can make to one another. It stood out to me in the story of John, the steadfast churchgoer, that he was not only committed, but also clear about what he could and would contribute. Not all of us are as good at boundaries as John. We often worry, as Brene Brown raised, too much about what others will think of us. Have you ever done something sweet because you were concerned about disappointing someone when you really just wanted to say no? Brown suggests that we should ask ourselves a very important question. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and to make the most generous assumptions about you? What if we asked this question about each relationship and community of which we're a part? What boundaries need to be in place and communicated so that I can honor the holy within me and honor the holy in you? Covenants are meant to build and reinforce compassionate, loving, and generous relationships. But in order for those covenants to be strong and sustainable, there have to be boundaries in place, which allow us to treat ourselves kindly while being generous with others. I love her line, "I'm not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving." Which would you rather be? Our Puritan ancestors were clear that covenant exists not only between people, but also between people and God. We have a double covenant, they said, made of community bonds as well as commitment to a higher vision, transcendent values, or a shared center which draws us together and moves us. We say every Sunday that love is the doctrine of our church. And I believe that our community and this covenant holds us accountable to that commitment. In our second reading, A. Powell Davies writes about how every time we go to church, we help renew the covenant. Going to church provides him with accountability, he says, to keep up to the standards that he has set for himself. He goes to church because it sharpens his conscience and enables him to be his best self. And he goes to church because he says, I must feel again the love I owe to my fellow people. I must not only hear about it, but feel it. And in church, I do. What he feels, I think another word for it is grace. And I think if Davies were to show up here at this church, he would feel that love. I hope that you do too. Friends, I want you to know this, that when you are generous and when you are not so generous, when you're sweet and when you are loving, when you are your best self and when you make mistakes, you are worthy of love. And when your neighbor is generous and not so generous, when they are sweet and when they are loving, when they are their best self and when they make mistakes, I hope that you will love them. I think that John knew this kind of love, and that's why he showed up every Sunday to create a home for others. I hope that coming to church reminds you of what you've been given and whose you are. Let us covenant to be a graceful, boundaried, and generous community, to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. We are called to be faithful to this promise. And in practicing it, let us make real the spirit of mutual love that will not let any of us go. We can do this for each other. So go and make it so. Amen.